For the senior faculty of this department, the introduction will be probably unnecessary. So, and because it will be long, I might start talking. And Helen will forgive me, hopefully. But anyway, it's with great pleasure and a certain degree of pride, which is probably misplaced, that I introduced to this room Dr. Helen Janiszewski of Carnegie Institution of Washington, Department of Terrestrial Magnetism, that deals with seismology primarily right now, where she is currently a postdoc. Helen did her undergraduate studies at Rutgers University, and she obtained a degree in she majored in geology, but because the program is so light and unimposing, she also majored in physics. And because that program didn't occupy her time too much, she also minored in math and did a degree in a language. I believe it was Russian. So after all of that, and all done in 4 years with honors and awards that I cannot remember all of them because they were numbered, but I believe this department awarded every conceivable award we have to Helen in sequence. You can look it up on the website. It's all listed in the roster of past awards. Helen moved on to the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory at Columbia University, where she pursued a PhD program in geophysics, specifically in seismology, and completed that in 5 years. And about a year ago, she finished her PhD and moved on to Carnegie, where she's currently a postdoc, about halfway through, and I presume currently already looking for the next phase of her career, which I'm sure will be spectacular. I believe this department should seriously consider expanding the geophysics roster, but anyhow, this is very selfish of me to say. Without much further ado, Helen works on the structure of the Earth, uses seismic waves to look into it, because I'm very partial to that. It's my delight and pleasure to welcome her here. Here's the lightsaber somewhere. Oh, I have a. You have your own. I have my own. But before I let you off the hook, in addition to lightsaber, we have a device that we now give to all of our speakers. It allows you to remember things, but also to open things. Oh, and this is very useful. That is very useful. And it will. It has and it's branded. So that's anyway, great. Welcome, Helen. Thank you very much. Thank you, Vadim, for that introduction. And thank you all for being here today. It's really great to be back here. And so my talk today is going to be figuring out the Forearc Shoreline-Crossing Seismic Imaging in the Cascadia Subduction Zone. And this is work I've done with Jim Garrity and Jeff Abers, who were my PhD advisors, Zach Alon, who's now a professor at UC Santa Barbara, Haiying Gao at University of Massachusetts Amherst, and Elena Carton and Anne Bissell, who are active source seismologists at IPGP and Lamont. And so the work I'm going to be showing you today is all focused on seismic imaging results of Cascadia, which is the subduction zone off the northwest coast of the United States. So first of all, just to get us all on the same page, because I know this is a diverse department, why do we care about the forearc and subduction zones? And so the forearc is the area extending all the way from the trench, the margin, where the Juan de Fuca plate is subducting beneath the North American plate, up until the arc of volcanoes that we have onshore. So this is the area that I'm going to be focusing on today. And one of the reasons why we care about the forearc is it's where megathrust earthquakes can occur. And so you might have seen this article about 3 years ago in the New Yorker called The Really Big One. And it was an article that got a lot of press at the time about the possible scenarios of what happens if a large megathrust earthquake happens off the Pacific Northwest of the United States to Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. And it had some of these great quotes in it. For example, by the time the shaking has ceased and the tsunami has receded, the region will be unrecognizable. Our operating assumption is that everything west of Interstate 5 will be toast. And so a lot of people got scared when this article came out. And so certainly if you have any ties to solid earth science, you probably got emails and phone calls and texts from friends at the time asking, should I really be worried about this? And one of the interesting things about Cascadia for why we are worried about this potential scenario in the region is something called the Orphan Tsunami of 1700. And I just want to briefly mention it because it's one of the most elegant detective stories in earth science related to earthquake history. And so in 1700, there was a tsunami recorded in Japan. And at that point, they had written historical records. However, there was no earthquake that went along with it. There was no shaking in Japan that they could figure out caused the tsunami. And so eventually, looking at geologic records in the northwest of the United States, they figured out that there was tsunami records and subsidence records that correlated to a large, approximately magnitude 9 earthquake happening there. Because of that and the historical records in Japan, they were able to figure out that on January 26th or 27th, there was a approximately magnitude 9 earthquake that ruptured basically the entire subduction margin off the coast of the northwest United States. And so we know it's happened in the past. It was about 300 years ago. So we care about the potential for it to happen again in the future. And then, of course, more generally, subduction zones are important for our global tectonic perspective because they are what transports materials and volatiles down into the deep earth. That is the system that we get stuff from the surface into the deep earth. So this is a cartoon just illustrating your typical subduction zone. You have your lithosphere going down, and you have these cartoons of fluid pathways coming up. And there are various parts of the system that we are interested in, one of which is what are the inputs, what is the structure of the oceanic plate before subduction even happens. And then the forearc area, so how do whatever structures are in the oceanic plate and their interaction with the overriding plate, how is that going to affect tectonic behaviors such as earthquakes? And we have this, view of, you often see subduction zones in this 2D profile, but in reality, we're more and more coming to understand that subduction zones and the interface in between these two plates is a complicated area. So this is a cartoon from Rayleigh et al. 2012, illustrating this idea of a plate interface in a subduction zone. So here's your downgoing plate, this is your overriding plate, and these different colors represent areas of different seismic behavior. So these dark gray areas labeled seismic are what's known as asperities, and so those are thought to be these areas where the two plates are stuck together, and that would initiate rupture in a large megathrust earthquake. Then there's this idea of this larger area that's conditionally stable, so an earthquake might not rupture there, but you can still get slip propagating through it. And then down dip and up dip, you have these areas that are aseismic. But again, to emphasize, this is a growing idea. This is a cartoon. In terms of actual images and our understanding of what sort of structures might make up a scenario, a cartoon like this, something that we still don't have a lot of constraints on. So that brings me to my research questions, and that's what are we trying to learn about the forearc in Cascadia? So my first question is, what is the structure of the incoming oceanic plate prior to and throughout subduction? And again, I am a seismic imager. I use information about seismic velocities and seismic properties to understand something about the interior of the Earth. And just to give you a comparison between what our understanding of onshore regions versus offshore regions is illustrated by these two cartoons. So you've probably seen these colored images that represent seismic tomography results. So this are different seismic velocities, and this is a region onshore the northwest United States, Washington, Oregon, California, and the colors represent the different velocities. And so you can see that onshore we have a pretty nice resolution image of variable velocities, and we can then infer something about material properties. However, offshore, if you don't have seismometers over the area that you are studying, you're pretty limited in terms of the resolution you can get. And so you can still get seismic velocities from these global studies. However, you can see this is our area of interest here in the Pacific Northwest, and it makes up about 4 to 6 pixels in this result. And so it's a totally different scale. So one of the things that I'm interested in is by using seismometers that are deployed in the oceans, how can we improve the resolution of images that we have in this area? And then what can we learn about the structure of the oceanic plates that we didn't know before? The second research question is, how do variations in structure of the subducting plate influence seismic behavior? And so in Cascadia in particular, we have these really intriguing along margin variations in seismic behavior. What I'm showing here on the left is a model that fits paleoseismic rupture of the 1700 earthquake. So these colors represent the amount of slip that would have occurred in that 1700 earthquake. And what you should take away from this is that it's not that the entire area all slipped in one go. There are these patches going north to south where there was more slip in certain areas and less slip in other areas. So what's causing the fact that we have more and less slip? What structures cause this variation? And then similarly, down dip of where we have megathrust earthquakes in Cascadia, we have a phenomenon called episodic tremor and slip. So that is something where the plate is slipping slow enough that you don't generate a large magnitude 9 earthquake, but you still have plate motion. And along strike in Cascadia with that type of behavior, we see variation in the recurrence interval of these episodic tremor and slip intervals, and that's what's being shown in colors here. So it ranges from a recurrence interval of 10 to about 25 months. And so you can see that there's this north-south pattern. So again, what is causing these different types of tectonic behavior, and what role does the incoming oceanic plate have to play with, what role does the incoming oceanic plate have in that, if any, at all? And then finally, related to that, my third research question is, what does the transition from locking to stable sliding along a subduction plate interface look like? So I've introduced these concepts that you have locking in a certain area offshore, which is where your megathrust earthquake occurs, and then down dip you move into this episodic tremor and slip region, and down dip of that you end up in an area where you don't have earthquakes. But so what is actually causing the fact that the plate is locked in some areas and can cause a large magnitude 9 earthquake and doesn't occur in certain other areas? And we have these ideas of structures that will vary. So this is illustrated in this cartoon from Safar and Tobin. Here is a typical cartoon of a subduction zone. You have this area down here, which is where your episodic tremor and slip would occur, and it's thought to be associated with overpressured fluids, possibly metasediments along the plate interface. And then the idea is that as you move up into the lock zone, you have to be able to accumulate strain, and so then you would have fewer fluids along the plate interface. And what's key about that is this variation in fluid pressure is something that we should be able to observe in terms of seismic properties. So we can use seismic imaging as a way to image this plate interface to see if we see features that are correlated with this idea. The trick, and the reason why we don't have that answer yet, is that while we have good seismic images of subduction zones onshore, an example of which I'm showing here from Abers et al., these colors are just showing variations in shear wave velocity, and basically this red blob here is the downgoing oceanic crust. This is going from the coastline inwards. We haven't had seismic instruments deployed in a location offshore where we can get the same types of seismic images. And so we don't know what the seismic structures look like as we move offshore in Cascadia, which is where we expect the lock zone to be. So we don't have data, haven't had data until now to interrogate this area. So those are the 3 research questions that I'm interested in and I'm going to be talking about today. So how are we addressing these 3 research questions? And it's using seismic imaging, because I'm a seismic imager. And just to give you a brief overview of the techniques I'm going to be using today so that we're all on the same page, there's 2 scales I'm interested in. One is this larger plate scale structure, and the other scale is going to be this plate interface structure. And so for the first technique, I'm using something called Rayleigh wave phase velocities. Now for seismic, data. There are lots of different types of waves that you can use, and they have different sensitivities. They travel in different ways. Rayleigh waves are surface waves. So you have an earthquake that happens someplace in the globe, and the waves are going to travel along the surface of the Earth and eventually be recorded by your seismometer somewhere else, in this case in Cascadia. And they have a feature called dispersion. And so what that means is that they have different periods. So here I'm showing 20 seconds, 25 seconds, 32 seconds, etc. Each of these waves has been filtered at a different period. And if you remember anything about physics, period is related to wavelength. And so a different period wave has a different wavelength. It's sampling a different depth into the Earth. And typically, seismic velocities increase as you go deeper down into the Earth. And so the 20-second wave samples only a shallower portion, so it's moving slower, coming in at a later time. And as you move to longer periods, it's sampling deeper into the Earth, and it's starting to move faster, so coming in at an earlier time. So that's the dispersive property that you're seeing here. And what you can think of it as is that they're giving you this nice average picture of seismic velocities with depth. So they're sensitive to a range of depths, which is what I'm illustrating here. On the right, it's not a particular depth, but it's giving you this nice depth averaged velocities, but it's a larger scale type of seismic imaging. For plate interface structure, I'm going to be using two different approaches, the first of which is something called Recever functions. Again, these are calculated where you have an earthquake that happens someplace on the Earth, and now the waves travel through the interior of the Earth and eventually are recorded at the seismometer. And what's key about this type of technique is that they are sensitive to abrupt velocity boundaries. So we're not getting any sort of nice depth average velocities. Instead, if you have a velocity interface in a particular region underneath your seismometer, your initial P wave from your earthquake, which is a compressional wave, is going to come up, and when it hits this abrupt velocity boundary, one of the things it's going to do is it's going to convert into an S wave. And that S wave is going to arrive sometime after your P wave, because P and S waves have different velocities. And then you're also going to get these reverberations, which are a mix of reflections within this layer of P waves and S waves that will come in later. And so the key thing is to remember this is a cartoon of your receiver function. Something about when these different arrivals come in is going to tell you something about how thick that layer is and what the velocities in that layer are. So that's the key thing to remember. It's only giving you information about abrupt velocity boundaries. And because of that, this is a good technique to investigate the plate interface structure, and because it's an interface, that's something that we're interested in. And so this is going to be used to get at what the plate interface structure is in the lock zone offshore. And then finally, another technique I use for getting at plate interface structure is active source reflection data. So this is similar to the receiver functions in the sense that it's still a technique that is sensitive to abrupt velocity boundaries. We're dealing with reflections. However, the geometry is very different. In this case, you go out with a ship. In this case, it was the Langseth. It tows an air gun array behind it, which creates seismic sources, which travel through the water column and through the crust, and they will reflect if you have an abrupt velocity boundary and then be recorded by this line of seismometers that we had deployed onshore. So similar to the receiver functions, it's higher frequency, so it gives you a bit of a higher resolution picture, but it's very limited in its location to this line of stations that you have. This is just kind of an example of what a good active source set of data might look like. The stuff I'm going to be showing you that I'm working with is much lower quality. You would have a distance on the x-axis, time on the y-axis, and the key thing is you're looking for when these coherent arrivals are coming in, and you're using that to interpret something about the velocities in the area. And again, this is going to be used for interpreting plate interface in this broad locked region. Okay. So that is what I'm doing. And you might ask, okay, why haven't we answered these questions already? This is data and techniques that have been around for a while, so what's the holdup? And the key problem with subduction zones in general is that you have this amphibious system. Half of the area that you're interested in is in the ocean, and half of the area that you're interested in is onshore. And those are very different types of fieldwork. Sure, onshore it's not always peachy. You might have a downed tree that you have to cut down in order to get to your field site to install your seismometer, but it's a lot different than an oceanic environment where we have to deploy these things called ocean bottom seismometers, which require going out on a ship, and you drop them onto the bottom of the seafloor for a year and hope they come back. And if they don't, you are out $100,000. So that's a problem. And from 2000 to 2018, this is just a sampling of the long period OBS. So that's the type of OBS that I would be using for my types of experiments and questions that I'm interested in that have been deployed by this organization, OBSIP, which is the US OBS organization. And so you can see that it's only in these few locations on the seafloor that we really have detailed seismic imaging of what the oceanic plates look like. Everywhere else, there's some international experiments that I'm not including in this map, but it's restricted to these couple of areas. And in particular, if I only show the modern OBS experiments, so this is kind of with more modern instrumentation, you'll notice that a lot of them, it's only until recently that we've been starting to deploy them along these kind of coastline areas. This is our Cascadia initiative, which I'm going to talk to you in a bit. This is the data set that I'm using. And in particular, one of the holdups has been the ability to deploy these instruments in shallow water. So this is instruments in less than 500 meters of water, and there have been a few isolated ones here and there, but for the most part, this Cascadia experiment was the first time that we were actually deploying them in this very shallow water. So, as I already mentioned, the experiment that I'm using for this data is called the Cascadia Initiative, and it did a couple of new things with ocean bottom seismometers that we hadn't been able to do before, and that had really been a holdup for studying subduction zones in this way. This was led by Doug Toomey and others. It was a community experiment, so it had a large group of people behind the proposal for it. And one of the big things it did was it engineered this new types of instruments. They're called trawl-resistant instruments. So the key for deploying in shallow water was that they had to be able to survive these ocean bottom trawlers, fishing nets. Because if your OBS gets stuck in one of them, you mess up your data, and you also mess up the fishing net, and no one is happy at the end of the day. So they designed these new types of instruments with American Recovery and Reinvestment Act money so that they could deploy them in shallow water. But so this is what the outcome of that was for the Cascadia Initiative. So it was a 4-year community deployment of about 70 ocean bottom seismometers. It covered the entire Juan de Fuca plate at the same type of station spacing as we have onshore, so that we can seamlessly go and image from offshore to onshore throughout the Forearc region. So it's from summer 2011 to summer 2015, because it was a community experiment, the data was open access, and it was really unprecedented at the time in its size and scope of a modern OBS experiment. And when I'm going to show you my results today, I'm basically going to gloss over everything that you need to do for dealing with ocean bottom seismometer data, because you would probably not be very interested in it. But I'm just going to briefly mention that you cannot just use ocean bottom seismometer data as if it's an onshore instrument. This is just an example of one type of noise that you run into, something called compliance. Basically, the waves in the ocean exert a pressure force, a change in pressure exerts a force on the seafloor, and the seafloor actually moves up and down slightly. And that's a real problem when you're trying to measure things like displacement with your seismometer, so you need to do things to take that into account. I'm not going to go into the details, but suffice to say, this is an example of what your data might look like when you start, and this is what it looks like for an earthquake that you've recorded after you do those corrections. So you can imagine that if you tried to do the same processing techniques on your original data, you're not going to get much out of it. You need to go through lengthy correction processes in order to be able to use the offshore data in the same way seamlessly with the onshore data. But I'm not going to go into any of that today. Everything I'm going to show you is just going to be after we do all those corrections, and we can use the offshore data just the same as the onshore data. And then finally, just to introduce you to the second part of the experiment, there was also these active source seismic experiments in the area, so that's going to make up the third part of the data that I use. And it's in this same general area of some of the other Cascadia Initiative experiments. These are the Cascadia Initiative OBS here in the black dots, but it's in a much smaller focused region offshore central Washington, and we'll get into that more later. Okay, so we're going to start out with plate scale structure. So what are we learning about the Cascadia subduction zone at large? So these are, remember, the first technique that I'm talking about, Rayleigh wave phase velocities, just to show you an example of what this data looks like and convince you that the offshore data is just as good as the onshore data. In gray, our OBS data, black, our onshore data. This is for a particular recorded earthquake that happened in the South Pacific. And you can see that these are surface wave arrivals, the information that we're going to be using, and the data looks pretty consistently good throughout the entire array. And then we also use something called ambient noise, which you may have heard about at some point. Ambient noise is just looking at correlations between particular pairs of seismometers, and we're measuring the speed of propagation of the noise field rather than that of earthquakes. And so the key thing to see in this data is just the correlation. So distance here, time here. It's moving at a particular velocity. Each one of these traces represents the correlation between a particular station pair. And you can see You can see OBS in blue and onshore data in red. And again, it all looks pretty good. So this gets us to our first question. What is the structure of the incoming oceanic plate prior to and throughout subduction? And this is the data that we have. So what I'm showing you here are maps at different periods. Just to guide you a bit, in parentheses, I've put an estimate of around what depths they might be sensitive to, but remember, those depths are a range, so don't look at this and be like, oh, okay, this is what the seismic velocities are at 15 kilometers. It's not that simple, but just so you have in your head thinking about what depths these might be. So each one of these is a map. Colors represent phase velocities. The blue colors are faster, which would mean they're colder. That could mean that it's less melt. That could mean less fluid or more mantle. And then the red velocities are slower, which is consistent with hotter temperatures, more melt, more fluid, less mantle. And so a few things that you can immediately see here, particularly at these short periods, the oceanic plate is very blue, very fast, and if you pay attention to kind of the depths that we're at, that makes sense because we should be well into the oceanic mantle for these periods, whereas onshore we're still within the continental crust and oceanic mantle. Mantle is faster than crust, so that makes sense. We see beneath the ridges here, they're a bit slower, which is consistent both with a hotter oceanic plate and more melt beneath the ridges. We see it gets faster as we move away from the ridge as the oceanic plate is cooling. Slow velocities beneath the volcanic arc, which makes sense in terms of melt and hotter temperatures. But we're seeing a lot of detail, and we're seeing a lot of detail in the oceanic plate itself as well. So just again to remind you, this is what we're coming from, so about 4 pixels here, and this is the level of detail that we can now get in terms of using these seismic velocities for understanding what the oceanic plate seismic velocities are and inferring something about the physical properties of the oceanic plate. And in particular, one of the key comparisons we can make is to thermal plate cooling. And so you've probably heard at some point, you know that the plates are created at the ridge, they move away, the plate moves away from the ridge. As it moves away from the ridge, it cools, so it should be getting cooler, and we can do something in terms of predicting what seismic velocities we might expect for that simple half-space cooling model. And this is just showing differences from the predicted phase velocities for a simple half-space cooling model based on the age of the Juan de Fuca plate versus what we're observing. And they're not huge, but it's not as simple as just simple oceanic plate cooling. We are seeing more variability that certainly is consistent with melt upwelling beneath the ridge. Intriguingly, along the margin area, we're also seeing what seems to be evidence of potentially some areas of maybe hydration. So that would be fluids kind of getting into the plate and slowing it down a little bit, which would have implications for how much fluid can then get transported down in subduction. So this is a work in progress. It's a lot of different variables that can go into this, but the oceanic plates are not simple things. We are seeing more heterogeneity than just would be predicted by these cooling models. So that's one takeaway. And then we can also start to come to our second question: how do variations in structure of the subducting plate influence seismic behavior? And for that, we're going to zoom in now on the forearc, still focused on the entire margin. And I'm looking at 10, 20, and 40 seconds period. Here's, again, rough ideas of their depth sensitivities. And I'm showing you here just plots of the kernels, the sensitivity kernel. So this is what depths we would expect this map of seismic velocities to reflect. And I'm also plotting the depth to the slab along the coastline. So that basically just to keep in mind whether or not these velocities might be reflecting structures that are above the subducting crust, within the subducting crust, or below the subducting crust. So there are a few things that we can compare these seismic velocities to try and understand what might be causing the variability along strike. One of which is this thing called Bouguer gravity anomalies, which reflect density. And the key thing in Cascadia is that there are these patches of negative Bouguer gravity anomalies in Cascadia, which are representative of these sedimentary basins in the forearc. And they're about coincident with these areas of higher predicted slip in this past Megathrust earthquake in 1700. So if we overlay the Bouguer gravity contours on top of our seismic velocities, and again, remember these areas of negative Bouguer gravity are coincident with estimated areas of past slip, we see that the low velocities pretty much coincide with where these negative anomalies occur, particularly at the shorter periods or shallower depths. So the low velocities seem to coincide with areas of high slip in past megathrust earthquakes. So maybe this is something to do with how the forearc structure has been either altered in past earthquakes, or maybe it's just a reflection of some sort of variable structure that has to do with past megathrust earthquakes. We don't really know. We can also look at the tremor density along strike. So again, remember this is just another type of seismic phenomenon, but it doesn't generate large earthquakes. And if we plot that, we see that it's consistently down dip of where we have these slowest velocities. However, the higher density regions of tremor tend to be aligned, at least along strike, with these areas of slower seismic velocities. And particularly at 40 seconds, we should be at least somewhat sensitive to structures within the subducting mantle. And so maybe there are some variations in the subducting plate that are still correlated with variable tectonic behavior, but we're not totally sure yet. And so now I'm going to move on to interface scale structure and receiver functions. We are now focused on this northern half of our system. So here's Washington, here's Oregon, and we're going to focus on this area just offshore central Washington. This is just showing you the locations of stations where I calculated receiver functions. The colors represent a number of earthquakes that we could use for the calculation. You can kind of think of it just as a data quality metric. Blacker colors mean it was a better station. And we're going to be focusing on these particular stations just offshore central Washington there. Now again, remember with receiver functions that all of these arrivals can be interpreted as something about an abrupt velocity boundary beneath the station. I'm showing you examples from several different stations. These are individual receiver functions calculated from individual earthquakes. Excuse me. This is the lag time over here on the y-axis, and each one of these panels is a different OBS station. And then I'm showing you an onshore station as comparison, and you can kind of get a sense of the difference in data quality from an onshore station, the amount of events that we can use versus the amount of events that we can use for these offshore stations. However, the key thing to remember here is that, or to notice here, is that we see consistent arrivals coming in not only for events at a particular station, but across multiple stations for these shallow water shelf stations. And so that's telling us that it's good quality data that we can use to actually infer something about the structure of the plate interface. And so what we can do is we're going to use this technique called the Bayesian joint inversion for shear velocity. Summary is we're going to use the coincident constraints from the receiver functions, which give us information about these abrupt velocity boundaries, and the surface waves, which give us this broad average velocity structure to get a velocity model beneath this particular station. So what I'm showing here is the velocity model that we get. Y-axis is depth. This is shear wave velocities. The colors are just essentially probabilities. So redder colors mean that it's a higher probability that our velocity is that value at a particular depth. And the way this works is you iterate over about 500,000 forward models, and it's trying to fit synthetic data to both our phase velocities and our receiver functions. So here in red is the data, and black are the synthetics that it's trying to fit, and it's accepting these as valid for our velocity model construction. And so the key thing is that about where we expect there to be the plate interface, we have this velocity inversion. We have a low velocity zone. And then a couple kilometers below that, about where we would expect the bottom of the subducting oceanic crust to be, we have what we are interpreting as our subducting moho, and then we get into oceanic mantle velocities. But offshore, in this, what should be the broadly locked region, we have a plate interface low velocity zone. And so then that brings us to our final question: what does the transition from locking to stable sliding along a subduction plate interface look like? And we do this at a couple of different stations. These are just plotted in order from closest to the coastline at the right and to farthest from the coastline on the left. And remember, just schematically, we're essentially trying to use these to fill in this area where a bunch of question marks, because we want to know what the plate interface looks like offshore. And we see at several of these stations, we have this low velocity layer at the plate interface within the lock zone of the megathrust. And that's indicating that there should be weaker structure in at least some of these locations. But one thing you should remember is the cartoon that I showed at the beginning was that there shouldn't be a low velocity zone as we move into the lock zone, because it should be associated with less pore fluid pressure and not so much sediment, because we need there to be strength along the plate interface in order to accumulate the strain. So this is not what we necessarily would have expected, certainly at least not if we're interpreting these low velocities as evidence of elevated pore fluid pressures. But there are other things that could be causing them. So hydration, elevated pore fluid pressures could be something, metasediments, or just a general subducted sediment channel might also be something that could cause this. Maybe it isn't that at all. Maybe it's something that's more just like a highly type of sheared material along the plate interface. Anyone that's ever gone out and looked at a fault in the field knows it kind of looks like a mess. What would that do to these seismic velocities in a subduction area? We don't totally know at these depths. So we don't know exactly what this is yet, but it's intriguing. And it's not necessarily as simple as what that 2D cartoon suggests. And then finally, we're going to bring in this last type of seismic data, the wide-angle seismic reflections. Remember, this is complementary to the receiver functions. And again, we're going to try and get the plate interface structure within this locked region, but it's a higher frequency data. And we're going to be focusing first on basically just this 2D profile. So the receiver functions I showed you were calculated from these stations here. So first we're going to focus on just about 10 or so kilometers to the north, this 2D line. So this is an example of the wide-angle seismic data from two of these stations, CW1 and 5, which are located here and here. This one's closer to the coastline, this one's further. And remember, y-axis is time, x-axis is distance. So this is the distance between a particular shot from the ship and the station location. And so each one of these is essentially a seismic wiggle moving vertically. And then we can see when the arrivals actually are showing up. So this is the cartoon illustrating what type of geometry you should be thinking of when you're looking at that data. And what we notice with these two stations used as an example are there's two types of arrivals that we're seeing. We're seeing something that has a relatively slower velocity, which are these arrivals that I've labeled as A1. Those are the first arrivals that we're seeing at both of these stations. However, at some of the stations, we see this type of arrival coming in, which is not observed at this station that is closer to the coastline. And in particular, this arrival is faster, and it has these really high amplitudes associated with a part of it. Now, if we do forward modeling, what we can explain these first A1 arrivals as rays that have only traveled within the overriding crust, and we can explain these arrivals in terms of their timing and velocity as rays that have reflected off of the plate interface. But so why are we only seeing the reflections off of the plate interface at certain stations, and why do they have really high amplitudes at some locations? I'm showing you basically the exact same data that I just showed you on the previous slide. Each one of these is, again, a particular station. However, the colors represent relative amplitude. So I'm no longer showing you the waveforms. Just the red patches are amplitudes that are highest at a particular station, and the blue patches are lower amplitude. And again, this is just the x-axis for shot to station offset time, and I'm zoomed in on these particular arrivals that we're seeing. But so yeah, basically the same exact type of seismic data, just plotting it in such a way as to emphasize this amplitude variation, which is what we're interested in explaining. And these are 4 stations close, again, to the coastline, with this station here being closest to the coastline and then moving farther away from the coastline as we get farther away. So what we can do is we've already determined that these sets of arrivals can be explained by a ray geometry that is reflecting off the plate interface. And using a simple forward model, we can predict the relative amplitudes that we would expect just for that type of ray geometry. And that is what I'm showing in these lines on top. And the key thing is at these stations that are farther from the coastline, the high amplitudes that are predicted align with where we're seeing the high amplitudes. At the stations closer to the coastline, the high amplitudes that we predict are not matched by high amplitudes in the data. So what is causing that to happen? And if we look at the ray geometry, the takeaway is that for the stations that are closer to the coastline, we actually are expecting them to reflect off the plate interface farther up dip. And the stations that are farther away from the coastline, we're expecting them to reflect farther down dip. And so what we can do is map along our plate interface an area of high reflectivity down dip and no reflectivity up dip. So the key takeaway is that it's structure along the plate interface that is changing, that is causing this variation in reflectivity that we're seeing at the stations. And again, this brings us back to our final question that we've already addressed with the receiver functions, but based on these active source results and looking at this very simple 2D cartoon, what it seems to be is that down dip, we're seeing the reflections which are consistent with high reflectivity, which would be consistent with these elevated pore fluid pressures and sediments. And then as we move up dip into this locked region, that goes away, and so that's explaining the disappearance. So that 2D profile fits in with what we thought we should see from this, very simple 2D cartoon of what a subduction zone structure is. And again, to show it in map view, down dip, have a reflective area, up dip, no reflectivity. However, there are other stations and other ship lines in the area where we can just qualitatively investigate some of this off 2D profile data. If we do that, we come up with a much more complicated pattern of some areas where it seems like this reflective structure extends much farther up dip. So I should say that these lines are basically representing the midpoints between the shot and the station. So they're approximating basically the point at the plate interface that it's sampling with the reflection. So we have some areas where it's extending much farther up dip, and then some areas where it seems to the reflective structure is not extending very far up dip. So the key thing is it's not a simple 2D structure, at least in this area. We're seeing evidence that the plate interface structure, as you move along strike, is varying in terms of the seismic properties that we're seeing, and that has implications that the actual structure of the plate interface in terms of downgoing sediments and fluids might be changing on a scale of tens of kilometers along strike. And again, just for reference, these are where we had the receiver function stations, and it makes an even more complicated story because here's where we have some of our low velocity zones, and this is a station where we don't. There's a little bit of complications because it's different types of scales that we're sampling with those, but the main takeaway is that we seem to be seeing a pretty complicated plate interface structure, at least in this small kind of 50 kilometer square region in Cascadia. So, to summarize, we have really intriguing multi-scale variability that we're seeing in the seismic structure of the Forearc region in Cascadia, both on the entire margin scale, where it seems to be that some of these variations in seismic velocity are at least correlated with variations in past seismic slip and other seismic properties, and on this tens of kilometer scale, where it seems like it's a very heterogeneous plate interface structure. To just give you, if you remember nothing else, short answers to the research questions I started the talk with. What is the structure of the incoming oceanic plate prior to and throughout subduction? It's more heterogeneous than we thought initially. How do variations in the structure of subducting plate influence seismic behavior? We don't know, but we're seeing a lot of intriguing correlations, and so getting these new high-resolution observations are going to be one part of trying to figure out what types of materials seismic velocities are reflecting and how it influences tectonic behavior. And what does the transition from locking to stable sliding along a subduction plate interface look like? It's more complicated than a 2D profile. And there are really interesting questions that some of these observations can start to help us answer. So are these heterogeneous plate interface structures that we're seeing, do they reflect something that is akin to the scales of these asperities that might modulate plate interface locking? However, that's a little bit of a complicated, and it doesn't entirely make too much sense because geologic evidence of faults, both from drilling in subduction zones and abducted terrains from subduction zones, usually show that the areas that experience slip in these large earthquakes are on the scale of tens to maybe hundreds of meters, whereas the stuff that we're sensitive to is really on these kilometer scale. So maybe we're not actually seeing something, a structure that can necessarily modulate or is reflective of variable slip on the plate interface, but maybe it's something about some larger kind of crustal response or accretionary wedge response or something like that, or some combination of it. And then there's even more interesting stuff coming out of Cascadia. This is an example from a Bodmer et al. Paper that came out a few months ago, imaging the asthenosphere below the plate. And they're in fact suggesting that variations in the velocity of the asthenosphere reflect variations in the buoyancy of the asthenosphere, and that the buoyancy of the asthenosphere then impinges on the lithosphere, which then modulates locking along the plate interface. So that is something, linking from all the way from 200 kilometers depth to a feature that happens with megathrust earthquakes at 20 kilometers depth. And we don't know if any of these are really right, but part of figuring out all these different connected systems is going to be these multi-scale observations, some of which are going to be these seismic velocity observations. And just in general, more broadly, Cascadia isn't done. So this was a workshop that I went to this past summer. So it was myself and about 20 or so other geophysicists and geologists, and we're talking about some of these questions that I just brought up about how do we really start linking all these disparate data sets and observations together with modeling and things like that to really understand what's going on in the Cascadia subduction zone. Just out this summer is another one of these amphibious seismic deployments going offshore of Alaska. The data is going to be available next year, so as long as everything goes well with that, that's going to be another subduction zone where we're going to have similar types of observations with which to start comparing the Cascadia subduction zone. And more broadly, there's this larger subduction zone 4D initiative, which is not a funded experiment or anything, but there's a large community interest behind this idea of community experiments at subduction zones. So these are things that I hope to be involved in the future. So thank you.
Well,
Yeah.
Helen, great talk.
Oh, thanks.
Can you go back a couple of slides to show that map of, no, forward?
Yeah.
Right, so let me just get this clear.
Yes.
So those red patches, those are the high lock zones, right?
Right.
And those should be where you don't want to be in a big earthquake, right?
Yeah. Ish.
And then
Yeah.
map to the left, so you've got slow seismic velocity.
Mm-hmm.
Like you were saying, so it doesn't seem to make any sense in terms of, enhanced fluid pressures. I mean, if you get fluid pressures or you get more, that would contribute to the below seismic velocities, but that would loosen things up. It wouldn't lock things up.
Yeah, so it's a bit, so the idea behind this paper is that, so these velocities are reflective of the asthenosphere, so below the plate. And so what they're suggesting is that then where it's slower asthenosphere, it's more buoyant and pushing up. But yeah, I mean, I put this up because this is actually one of the thing is it gets complicated because this is a different type of seismic imaging, and the fact that all these things are correlated, and there are things that if you're not careful, shallow structure can also lead to artifacts in these types of seismic imaging. So this is actually something I'm working on currently with someone else who does this type of imaging, and we're trying to come up with a more robust multi-scale model to see how strong these things are. But that's the idea. But then there's also, it could also not be the actual buoyancy effect. For example, say you have more buoyant asthenosphere, that might change slightly like the dip of your subduction, and that might then change like the amount of sediment that could go down, and that might have then a turn and influence on the plate interface. So it's a very complicated system, and we're just starting to have new data on it.
One last thing.
Yeah.
Are you able to talk to geologists who look at the topography, the sediment influx, all the other things?
Yeah.
Maybe add another correlation.
Yeah, so I think, there were people like that at this workshop that I was at. And yeah, and so that is one of those things, is people that look at like variations in uplift along the coastline and trying to figure out why, because there are intriguing variations along strike and topography in Cascadia that people don't fully understand. So yeah, so I think it's, I don't talk to geologists on a daily basis about that stuff, but there definitely is a larger community group of people that is trying to facilitate those types of discussions. Yeah.
Other questions? And I was thinking, I have to ask you the basic question. What did you tell your friends? Should they run? Out west.
Yeah.
Would you consider doing fieldwork there again?
Yeah, I would. Yeah.
Consider retiring there.
No. at least not on the beach. I would, in Seattle that'd be fine, but.
Vancouver Island is all right.
Yeah.
So you took a job at UW?
Oh yeah, I would take it. Yeah, UW if you're what? No.
UW if you're listening.
Yeah. No. But I mean, I think, the thing actually, okay, this is actually a nice map. These seismometers that are represented by these white dots here, I actually installed with Jeff and Zach. That first picture that I showed you of us kind of trying to figure out how to cut down a tree was for this installation. And so we were staying right about maybe here somewhere. And you can kind of see that in particular is like one of these dangerous areas because look at like where is the closest high topography. It's there. There's a lot of like rivers and inlets and things like that. This is another bad place to be. This is another bad place to be. It really has to do a lot more with how quickly you can get to higher ground because it's mostly the tsunami that's the big issue in those areas. I think it's the tsunami plus the length of shaking. So I'm not a hazards person, but if people are interested, one of the scarier ones I read once was if it's a magnitude 9, you can expect a duration of shaking of up to like 5 minutes along the coastline, and then you have 15 minutes from when that shaking stops to get to high ground, and the shaking could be in excess of 1G, so like houses flung off of foundations along the coastline. So you can't assume you can drive or anything like that. So yeah, I wouldn't live right there or there. But
It's overdue. That's what that article's talking about.
yeah, I mean overdue though. When you've had the paleoseismic stuff has a recurrence interval of anything from like 250 years to probably like 700 years, so we're at 300. So I don't think overdue is that meaningful, and I feel like seismologists tend to not want to say anything is ever overdue because we don't really have enough data to figure it out.
You said earlier that there was some complexities in the migration of the oceanic plates.
Yeah.
Have you got any insights for that?
So, okay. Yeah. So there are reasons to think that there would be. So if you look here, so these thin lines are the isochrons, so the magnetic ages of the plate. And you see these things where they are not perfectly linear. There are these breaks in them. And so those are what are called propagator wakes. So they are areas of past ridge migration. And the people that do active source seismic imaging of the oceanic plate, which is really just imaging the oceanic crust. There are some variations in, say, roughness of bathymetry and the faulting, and at least in a few places they think they're seeing evidence of slower seismic velocities associated with these propagator wakes. However, the scales that we're looking at should really be more sensitive to mantle, so it's a little bit confusing why we're picking up on it. And in particular, we're not really seeing so much evidence out in the center of the plate. I mean, sure, we do see some, variations, but we don't see anything too much associated with these propagator wakes. What we're actually seeing is, focusing on is some of these patches here along the margin. And we can kind of basically show that those variations are really quite large compared to what we would expect for, simple variations in temperature or even sediment. Even if our sediment thicknesses are wrong, we can't really explain that away. So, there's definitely reasons to think that there's intriguing, that there's variations in hydration of the Juan de Fuca plate, but why we would be seeing it in the mantle, we're not quite sure yet. There's also one thing that this is glossing over is we're using a constant grain size. Grain sizes affect seismic velocity, so there might be some complexity with that. But to first order, the main point is that it's not, you couldn't draw a profile through this and it would be the same everywhere. We are seeing variations. Yeah.
Okay, there are barbarians at the gate. I think we need to clear the room. Thank you, Helen.
Yeah.
And everyone.